In this episode of 25 for 25, we will explore the poetry broadsides of the Broadside Press. We ponder what is a broadside and consider how an individual poet influenced a generation of writers. Thanks for listening. Broadside Press was founded in 1965 by Dudley Randall, a librarian at the University of Detroit, who with his small paycheck created a press to publish his own poetry and the work of Black poets. His aim was to publish new poets and new forms of poetry and to connect writers with a growing younger audience. For the next 20 years, Broadside Press published and distributed the work of hundreds of poets, earning him the title, the father of the Black poetry movement. Today, we see the press as publishing some of the major American poetry of the 20th century, including work by Gwendolyn Brooks, Margaret Walker, Audre Lorde, Alice Walker, Amiri Baraka, and Sonia Sanchez. Reading the poetry broadsides together brings into focus the power of poetry to magnify voices and experiences. It also speaks to a deeper story of struggle and the role of individual artists in building a community where Black art and creativity could thrive. Here, for example, is a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks titled Aurora, number 65 in the Broadside series, published in November 1972. Letterpress printed on textured lavender-colored paper, the broadside is 8.5 inches by 11 inches in size. As indicated in the colophon or imprint on the piece, it is the first and only broadside printed of 500 copies. The poem begins, "We who are weak and wonderful, wicked, bewildered, wistful and wild, are saying direct good mornings through the fever." I want you to imagine seeing this broadside at a frame, posted on a wall or a window, in a public place, a school, a library, or a community center. Why do you think Dudley Randall chose to publish in the broadside format? The broadside format dates back to the 16th century when printing technology gave rise to the broadside as a cheap, effective means of mass communication. A broadside is simply a large single sheet of paper, varying in sizes, printed on one side. Broadsides were produced in multiples, circulated by hand or posted in public places. Often they were read aloud. In the 1960s and 70s, poets and editors used the broadside as a means of speaking directly to the people, a way of distributing poetry to a wide public. Broadsides continue to be produced today to amplify voices and messages. After graduating from Wayne State in 1949 and earning his master's degree at the University of Michigan in 1951, Dudley Randall settled in the Black Bottom neighborhood of Detroit. Randall began writing poetry at a young age, but it wasn't until he was in college, influenced by the civil rights movement and his own experiences living in Detroit, that he developed his art and began submitting his poetry to literary magazines to be published. Randall was working as a librarian in Detroit in 1963 when he learned of the brutal bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. Randall wrote his poem, The Ballad of Birmingham, in response, and in 1965 he printed the poem in the broadside format, which became the first publication of the Broadside Press. Dudley Randall started the Broadside Press to distribute his own work and the work of Black poets. He chose to publish poems which he said reflected the Black experience. By 1965, he was publishing collections of poetry and anthologies. His expertise as a publisher and editor was sought after by several African-American literary magazines that were coming onto the scene at the time. Dudley Randall is a poet, a publisher, an activist, and an archivist. He intentionally collected, preserved, and documented emerging Black voices, using broadsides to reach and to inspire a new generation of readers and writers, reaching out from Detroit to connect with a broader movement of Black artists and activists. He aimed to advance a collective vision of Black pride for the cause of social justice then and now. The Broadside Press collection at the Yukon Archives forms part of a larger collection of poetry and audio recordings that feature poets originally published by the Broadside Press, as well as a growing archive of work by Black artists, writers, musicians, poets, and printmakers. Thank you for listening to this episode of the 25 for 25 exhibition featuring the poetry broadsides of the Broadside Press.